Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ashley Tanks. I'm a Senior Director at ChooseATL, and I want to start by just sharing a very special thank you to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights for partnering with us to create a platform to talk about advocacy for racial equity today. So we're honored to have some really incredible DEI leaders with us today. Please take advantage of this event and participate by sharing any questions or comments that you have in the chat box throughout the session. So just know that we'll be engaging you there. We also have a couple of fun Zooms throughout, Zoom polls, that we'll do as well. So we're looking forward to a really engaging session. We also will end with a Q&A. So again, as you think of questions, pop them in the chat box and we will try our best to get to as many questions as we can during our time together. So without further ado, let's get started. Please join me in welcoming the National Center for Civil and Human Rights Director of Innovation, Ryan Romerman.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ashley. And thank you all for being here today as we continue to advocate for racial justice. Now, at the center, we believe in civil and human rights for all. And our work serves to help people reflect on the past, transform the present, inspire the future, and ultimately take action. So our mission of creating safe, inclusive environments allows space for diverse perspectives to be shared, acknowledged, and respected, and valued. And your voice is important to us, and we're happy that you're here with us today. And with that, I'm thrilled to introduce Timon West, who is a facilitator who serves as our diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant for the center, where he helps our clients take part in brave conversations and examining ways to dismantle structural racism. But he's also an educator, a poet, a youth advocate, and hip hop artist who has traveled across the nation for decades to speak about timely issues at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and social injustice. And with that, I welcome Timon West.
Thank you for the introduction, Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak to everyone about my own journey as a pathway for everyone exploring their own. There are pivotal moments in our lives that define our story. Your story is your power and what will enable you to be a change maker. Own your story. Reflect on that moment that inspired you to take action. For me, one such moment was my HIV positive diagnosis that made me a little bolder to speak about the intersectionality of race, gender, sexuality, and social justice, and to become a catalyst of change. This revelation shaped my journey to focus on youth advocacy work and deepen my impact as a change maker. Each of us are on different paths in our change-making journey, but the first step, for me at least, was owning that as an intentional way that I wanted to have impact. So now I want to hear from each of you, because this is an interactive forum, on sort of where your journey is. And so there's going to be a Zoom poll that will launch. At this time, you should all see a poll appear on your screen that asks, where do you currently find yourself on your change-making journey? So please take a couple of seconds to answer the question, and then we'll share the results with you. And we'll be using these polls throughout my talk, at least to guide our conversation throughout the webinar. So please make sure that you respond. The first poll, some of what you might see, where do you currently find yourself on your change-making journey? You'll select one, awakening or awareness, which means I'm beginning to explore. Education and learning, which means I'm reading and learning. Self-examination or self-interrogation, I'm thinking about my actions or inactions. And then finally, champion or action, I'm doing my best to walk the talk and model for others. Appreciating the introductions in the chat. Okay, nice. I think we have some results here. Wow, a lot of people in that self-examination, self-interrogation space, right? 52% of you are thinking about your actions or inactions, which I think is a really good place to be. and then quite a few people that are champions who are doing their best to walk the talk and model that for others. Again, there's no judgment about any of these phases, but certainly a good thing to think about as I continue to talk through and share my journey. Through my extensive career centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I find myself as a champion in my change-making journey. And that's a journey that for each of you will be shaped by your different experiences. A plethora of experiences growing up awakened me to social justice. So for example, in high school, I was interviewed by recruiters from the US Military Academy at West Point, only to be rejected because it was pre-don't ask, don't tell, right? I disclosed my sexual orientation. They asked, I told, deeming it, I thought it was the honorable thing to do for a West Point prospect. Another defining experience is that I'm a preacher's kid. I left my dad's evangelical church to explore leadership, which was a pathway through the Boy Scouts at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? So like Black, Southern, evangelical to Mormon, what was wrong with me? I don't know. But it was at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that I would eventually come out to my bishop as gay and be rejected there as well. So there are a number of these experiences of experiencing rejection, exploration, interesting for those of you who are in the exploration phase. From a young age, I struggled with depression and anxiety due to experiences like these, due to the intersection of my race as a young Black male in society, and also my sexual orientation. However, these experiences heavily influenced my desire to support youth as an adult, to become that high school teacher, to become a varsity basketball coach or a youth development director. So what if you have opportunities to learn from even the hurtful experiences in your life, the traumatic experiences, and to transform them into your greatest attributes and strengths? Another anecdote is that I am a student that survived a suicide attempt when I was in high school. And because I wanted that teacher that I could talk to about all the various things I was thinking through in life, it informed my ability and my interest in becoming a teacher. And I was that guy at the school, in the high school, that all the kids felt comfortable talking to. I became the thing that I needed when I was a high school student. So again, like, what if you have opportunities to learn from even the hurtful experiences and transform them into your greatest attributes and your strengths? They shaped you into what you were meant to be. And so now we're going to go to a second poll question. A poll will launch. What do you believe to be your greatest strength? And there's some categories for this, right? One is connector. I use my network and knowledge to make connections. Empathetic. I listen and share in the emotions and experiences of others. Doer. I live in the world of action and learn on the go. Courageous. I use the power of my voice to speak up about issues that matter. And then there's other. You can chat anything in the box. Many of you probably, like me, are a combination of a number of these. So feel free to chat that in the box. And it could be a word that's not there that you identify with strongly in terms of a category. All right, so it looks like we have a poll here. Wow, lots of people that are empathetic, which doesn't mean that that's all you are, but I find that that's really interesting. People that listen and sharing the emotions and experience of others, 58%. That's really a strong showing. A lot of you are also connectors who use your networks to connect with other people, and then a number of doers and people that are courageous as well. My greatest attribute wasn't there. I would say that my greatest attribute and strength is my passion, which I'm sure is probably true for many of you as well. I identified this strength through my experiences with rejection, being a Black queer man. I'm inspired to change the lives of others and continue to do so every day through my leadership in spaces like Teach for America, where I train teachers and school leaders on how to advance safer and braver classrooms, in particular for LGBTQ students of color, so that those students don't have the same threats and barriers that I did growing up. One of the ways that I showed up in that way, for many of you that may have seen the film Moonlight, was I worked with the It Gets Better project to create a learning toolkit based on that film. I watched it and I was like, so much of this film is happening in school. How can we not have this just be a great film, but a teaching opportunity so that people can actually learn from the film in a different way? And you can look that up on the It Gets Better Foundation. If you put It Gets Better and Moonlight, it'll show the toolkit there. So that's one of the ways that I stepped up into my passion and took something that was just a film and created a toolkit around that in collaboration with others. It's important to remember that in our lives and as part of our movements and organizations, we have different strengths and weaknesses. There are different roles for each of us to play within the system of social change and within that ecosystem. So our final poll question for the night is, what kind of change maker are you? And so a poll will appear again. You're gonna have to have 3 categories, right? You can, I think, select multiple. Disruptor. I take uncomfortable and risky actions to shake up the status quo, to raise awareness and to build power. Storyteller. I craft and share our community stories, cultures, experiences, histories, possibilities through art, music, media, and movement. And builder. I develop, organize, and implement ideas, practices, people, and resources in the service of a collective vision. I know for me, I'm having a hard time. I'm probably all of them. And I'm sure many of you may identify. Oh, there's some other ones as well, right? Frontline responder. I address community crises by marshaling and organizing resources, networks, and messages. Many of you probably been responsive in the age of COVID and the pandemic around that. Are the protests and actions around Black lives. Lots of frontline responders these days because our times demand it. And then others you can actually chat in the box. I'm curious to see what happens here. What kind of change makers we got in the call? All right, let's see. I love some of the examples. Jennifer, I love your example in terms of forming an employee resource group. Yes, Susan, for helping in the COVID fight. All right, do we have the poll results? Oh, okay, let's see here. Lots of builders, right? I develop, organize, and implement ideas, practices. Yeah, we certainly need builders or people that are actually making things happen. Also, if I'm reading that right, yeah, that was, no, actually, it's, yes, builders is 61% of you identify as builders. Storytellers at 42%, right? People that really craft the community stories and cultures and experiences. I probably consider myself a disruptor. 21% of us identify with that. And then a few frontline responders. And again, a lot of people are going to be a part of multiple categories. So just a good orienting tool to think about how you want to make a difference as a change maker. I harness my strengths to become a change maker by combining my background in education and advocacy to improve the experiences of LGBTQ students in schools. I use my platform to empower others to speak up, to create a community of both safe and brave spaces where we can discuss issues that matter, like the space that we've created today. And I will say I do that through a number of different ways. As a hip hop artist and a poet, I remember creating a space in Inman Park. This was back in the day, it was called House of Integrity. Integrity, it was a tea shop. And we actually had spoken word and open mic nights there, but that served that dual purpose of bringing people together to sort of express their issues around politics and different things like that in a safe space. But we use music, poetry as a means to do that. And many of you are parts of communities that do that creatively. I also have very fond memories of Apache and the community of artists that came together there, and the community of audience members who enjoyed what we delivered. So those are multiple different kinds of ways that people do that. On your change-making journey, there are times where you should lead, and there are times where you should follow. Both are equally important in order to learn how to be an effective change maker. You need to listen, think, and take action. And from the poll results, there are lots of people here who lean into their empathy, who are listeners, who sort of corral the stories of our community and think first before leading and making that direct action and change. When should you lead? This is an opportunity to really think about your closest circles of influence, right? I think we often think about changing the big system, but right, there's your family, your friends, your community. Don't be afraid to step up and sort of fill them in. You're the leader that you've been waiting for. The power to enact change is in your hands. And so if you change one person's perspective, you've moved mountains. And I'm a firm believer of that. Oftentimes, even when we're talking about racial justice and racial equity, we want to change the system at our jobs, but we don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation with someone at the dinner table that's right there in our family. And think about that proximity and that sphere of influence that you have over someone that's actually proximate to you. If you change, again, one person's perspective, you move mountains. So it's something called sometimes these small acts of courage at the dinner table or the break room at work that shift the needle of change. My own father, the evangelical preacher, is probably one of my biggest fans now, but he was quite a different man when I was growing up, and someone that I quite often thought of as an enemy within my own household. And it wasn't until I began to be able to have some of those conversations with him, open myself and my life and experiences to him, that he actually was able to change and shift some of the ways that he was thinking. All right. So when should you follow? Black, Indigenous, and people of color have probably been doing a lot of heavy lifting. I know I certainly have in my own organizations, right? But we face challenges building long-term sustained support and pushing towards equity without the support of our aspiring allies. It's kind of a numbers game, right? I needed my father's support in creating the change that I want to see in the world, as different as we may have shown up at one point in time. Trying to recruit as much support as possible by doing your homework and finding out who's already doing the work where you are, who are the people in your circles, your family, your churches, wherever, that are already doing some of this work. Because it's even more powerful when you can push yourself beyond the comfort zones to do the work that's hardest. I suppose that's how I got the monkier Brave Educator, because I always welcome those conversations that challenge my comfort. I'm always a little bit comfortable being in uncomfortable spaces and challenging people and pushing people. Because there can be a dangerous delusion in the safe spaces, in our comfort zones, where we sort of are with the people that we most align with, most agree with. And having lived in Atlanta a couple of times, Atlanta is a place where beyond our work environments, you can kind of be with people that are just like you all the time. And so I think Atlanta is a unique environment to really push yourself beyond those comfort zones. I know this best because I push students and teachers and administrators to think again. I always say to them, growth stretches you. So remember, advocacy is ongoing, cross-functional work. And I want to thank each of you for being here. We'll have an opportunity, which I'm most excited about, to do some Q&A, to talk about the work that we do every day. And we'll be taking questions from the audience. So please enter your questions in the chat box below, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Timum, how amazing are you? I just want, if you are joining me in this like standing ovation, just type the word clap. Type the word clap. Thank you so much, Tamam. I have taken a page full of notes. You would think you had been speaking for an hour. I want to recap a couple of the notes that I've jotted down here. So you started off with a bit of alliteration, Tamam. I don't know if you realized it, but transform, trauma. There was the teacher, Timon, right? So you got a lot of T's going on. But I love this idea of transforming your trauma into your greatest attributes. I mean, how powerful is that as an aspiration? I think for us, not just, big picture in life, but, from a day-to-day basis, I think that is very powerful. I love the notion of creating both safe and brave spaces. I think we talk a lot about creating safe space, but we don't necessarily speak enough about creating brave spaces. And so I might, I won't appropriate that, but
Please.
I will attribute it to you, but I'm gonna use it. I think the other thing that I wrote down is this notion that there is danger in this dangerous delusions in our comfort zones.
Another little.
That is also, another alliteration. I'm a storyteller, by the way, on that poll. If you can't tell, I like words. But yeah, no, I think that's a good reminder, I think, for us all. And then this idea that we shouldn't be afraid to step up. And if you move one person, you have moved mountains. I feel like we should just let that sit with us as we get into the Q&A. So thank you again for teaching us and for teaching me just in a very brief period of time. So I've got a couple questions for you, Tamam. We, in our organization at the Metro Atlanta Chamber, ChooseATL, we have been talking a lot here recently, post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others who deserve to be named, but it would take us too long to name them all. Since all of that has happened, sadly, in our country and even in our own state, we've been talking a lot about this idea of racial equity, the aspiration that is racial equity. And so I'm going to ask you a couple questions that are specific to that. And I think when we speak about racial equity, we've been trying to be very specific that Black people are, needing to be overserved because we have been underserved in this country for entirely too long. And so when you think about that, how might you suggest those who are listening move from being anti-racist or being actively anti-racist instead of not racist? So moving from just saying I'm not racist to now being actively anti-racist.
Absolutely. We do a good job in America of not wanting to be racist, right? Like it's like a bad thing. I've been reading Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, of late. And I'll be honest, a vulnerable moment for me, when I first saw the title of the book, my immediate impulse was like, oh, well, this is a book for white folks. Like, I don't need to read this. Like, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think the surprise of the book was the way that it pushed me to think about racism as something, it's kind of the air we breathe in America. Our nation was founded on a lot of systemic racism. And so even as Black people, we can't really escape the racist conditioning. It's embedded in our education system, a lot of what we see in the media and on TV. And so I really feel like it's an opportunity. One of the things, here's a person writing a book on how to be an anti-racist who opens the book with talking about his racist speech in high school and owning that, like, okay, like what would it mean if I just owned that, like, as a product of racism in a racist society, that like I have a lot of racist views, right? And a lot of it, even if those are internalized racist views about myself. And I remember not fondly, like my high school graduation speech was probably horrible, like if I were to look at it now. But it's also like that ownership, how can I operate with grace for myself and say, okay, how can I undo some of that learning and some of that programming that I've had growing up in this racist society and actively begin to interrogate some of those notions, right? it's like a 6-step program or whatever step program, right? You can't really make the progress until you first admit that, like, you know what? Yeah, I make assumptions that I probably shouldn't make. When people walk into spaces in the room, no matter what their race or their gender or background is, that's a socialization thing that we do as self-protective, right? We make assumptions. I think the question is, how can we move beyond that space to operate and function differently? But we first have to admit that, hey, this is just real. And I think that that's a good first step in being an anti-racist, is first admitting, like, where have I fallen short? Where have I made assumptions? Where have I operated, if I'm Black, out of a place of pain and anger, which is often righteous indignation and very valid pain and trauma that we have experienced as Black people in this country. And for white people and for other people of color, you know, what messages have I internalized?
So yes, I don't know if any of y'all watch Jada Pinkett and the Red Tabletop, but I'm over here like, you know how she does that all the time. So thank you, Tim, so much in what you just shared. I was trying to look at the Q&A real quick, Tim. We've got a question that has come in. How do you influence change in the workplace to have more diverse representation in leadership, specifically Black leadership and female leadership? So any thoughts that you might have on being a change maker in that regard?
Absolutely. I think, when Pamela Newkirk spoke to the Metro Atlanta Chamber back in February, I was actually at that speech. And one of the things I appreciate about Diversity Inc. and her book is that we can make these tokenistic efforts. We can have a diversity council or create a resource group. But one of the things I feel was really powerful about what happened with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery is, like, people started saying, well, let's see your C-suite. Like, let's see what the demographics look like at the top of your organization. Let's look at things like retention rates by race, right? Let's look at the degree to which people of color or Black folk are actually able to move up in their organizations. Is there kind of a glass ceiling, right? Where a role or a place where they get, and we're not seeing them really elevate beyond that. I appreciate that challenge, because ultimately the progress is in the data, it's in the numbers. And I think that's where we begin to look and see, okay, where are the gaps and how do we actually address that? Maybe our recruitment practices are inherently biased against people of color or Black folk. Maybe there are white dominant cultural norms in terms of the ways that people show up at work that prevent certain people from moving up that ladder. So I think there are all kinds of ways that we can begin to look, but I would say, what's the numbers? Like, really look at your organization from a demographic perspective and begin to ask the questions of, like, who has the power in those organizations? And which is why, I think recently looking at the intersections of gender and race, like, how are Black women doing in their organization, right? That might be a good litmus test for how power needs to shift or change.
Yeah, and Pamela spoke so much truth to power that particular day. I have also gone back to what we learned from her. Yeah, I think that's all good. I'm trying to make sure I'm not ignoring any additional questions in the Q&A. I'll ask you one of my own really quickly. So, I love the poll and understanding, sort of what psychographically, sort of our audience is here today. We learned a lot, right? So I'm sure also in that group, you've got some people who are extroverts and some people who are introverts. And so can you talk to us a little bit about an introvert and what introverts might need to do or think about differently as they work to be change makers in their organizations?
It's interesting because I just got through talking about data, and I work with someone who, isn't the person that wants to be in front of the room leading in that way, but they love logic models and they love data. And so, like, that's the person that's going to crunch the numbers and come back to me and say, Tim M, did you see this? or like I've done this research, or I've read this new book, right? So there are all kinds of ways that introverts or people that are introverted can actually contribute to social change and justice through just being observers. One of the things in the poll that was a little bit surprising to me, but I thought it was promising, was the number of people that identified as empathic, right? Those are the people that like have a deep sense that something is not quite right. And I think that that's really important in our organizations, because I think one of the products of systemic racism is that it's created spaces where a lot of Black folk and people of color, we're just exhausted or tired with having to bring it up, right? I know when I'm in spaces where I have to even notice that I'm the only person of color in the room, or something is going on and you're like, okay, do I have to bring this up, or is someone else going to actually say that they noticed that this is what was happening? Or if there's a microaggression that happens, right? Someone says to me, which, I'd like to think I'm articulate, but do I have to be the person that corrects someone when they say, oh, well, you're very, very articulate, or, you're so well spoken? I'd like to think that some of my white allies can say, hey, with some grace and with some love, you realize like that's a little problematic to say that, right? Or it may be true that some of your best friends are Black, but as a statement, probably not. Let's talk about that, right? And I think it can become burdensome when we always look to the people of color or the Black folk to make those corrections and adjustments.
So it's funny. I think what you just said is good fodder for thought, especially for people who are introverted. But I'll see how you react to this. I often remind people, as a person of color, sometimes for me, a woman, sometimes the youngest person in a room, right, in certain spaces, my ability to be who I truly am and be authentic and raise my authentic point of view and my voice is actually activism and change making in and of itself, when you really show up and decide not to play small, but go on and play big and take up space, right? And so I think that that doesn't necessarily mean that an introvert needs to be extroverted, but it means that they need to show up as who they truly are, in order to show people something different and create a more welcoming environment, right?
I think it's also interesting because I find that some of the places I struggle, and this is a moment of just like humility and vulnerability, like I struggle in the one-on-one small conversations, right? So I'm good at making a big speech in front of a big crowd, but I think one of the places that some of my friends that are introverts really thrive in is I can have a one-on-one conversation with someone and really move. Again, part of the speech talked about how that needle of change or moving mountains is really about the courageous conversation to really get one person to move a little further. And not everyone who does great speeches is really good at that one-on-one work, right? So I think really honing in and realizing where is your sphere of influence. It could be gathering the data and providing the facts or making a suggestion. It could be the one-on-one conversation and not the big room.
Yeah, small acts of courage. That's what you reminded us of, right? So I'm gonna look at the Q&A. We've got a couple more questions that have come in. So it looks like Jennifer Thompson wants to know, she said, I'm just going to read it. I attended a webinar on racism in the corporate world, and it was very interesting. At my job, we wrote a letter to the CEO demanding more action, also going to Black colleges for recruitment, but here in Atlanta it's easy. But she raised the great point that the city infrastructure needs to be in place to support Black talent and people of color. So any comments based on that, Timma?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's infrastructure. I think it's also there's a hard reality and a harsh reality in Atlanta. Like, are we weighing the excellence that comes out of our HBCUs in the same way that we regard an Emory or a Georgia Tech, right? And that's a hard conversation that some people don't want to have, but sometimes that looks like looking at your recruitment data. Where are we getting people from? And not only where are we getting people from, but is the graduate from Clark Atlanta moving up in the organization at the same rate that someone from Georgia Tech or Emory or UGA, right? And oftentimes, I think our PWIs, and I'm a product of both, right? Like I went to PWIs and I did attend an HBCU as well. And the reality is, the harsh reality is sometimes, there are spaces where the fact that I went to a school like Duke has gotten me in certain doors when in fact, I feel like the quality of my education at Howard was no less than in terms of what I learned and who it has made me as an individual. And so I think we have to ask those really hard questions. Again, that goes back to that data. Are we collecting data on the colleges and universities of people that are part of organizations? And are we cross-referencing that data with like how fast people are moving through the organization? Because we can say we recruited a bunch of people from HBCUs, but where are they in terms of leadership within the organization?
Yeah. So I smile big when you said Clark Atlanta, because I am a Clark Atlanta alumna, and shouts out to all the HBCUs. I didn't know you went to Howard. And I think, we talked about this a little bit in our organization. A couple weeks ago, we did an unconscious bias training. And I think that sometimes we choose, we have bias towards, to your point, towards people who went to certain institutions, and we sometimes need to check that bias, right? And decide that we don't want to be, and we will not be biased simply based on the university or the college that's on someone's diploma, but you'll give them every opportunity to showcase whether or not they're the best talent for a particular job. So it looks like we've got Joel in the chat asking Disha and Timon, can you each talk about some challenges you had while finding your voice and how you overcame them? That's a good one, Timo.
Well, that is a good one. Finding my voice. It's interesting. There's a story around my name. Name's Timem, but it's not my birth name. And I stuttered as a kid, so that's how I actually got Timem. I could not say my name to save my life. With the speech impediment, like a stutter, I was actually quite an introverted kid, and I got through the impediment through musical theater and the arts. So my mother noticed that whenever I was singing, be that gospel or some kind of musical, singing and dancing like I was not stuttering. And I think that's true of a lot of stutterers. James Earl Jones, right? Like the voice of Darth Vader and the voice of God, in some instances was a stutterer. Bruce Willis, Marilyn Monroe, Carly Simon, these are all stutterers. And I think that it's not surprising that many of them found their way through the arts. I mention that because I think a lot of it is that listening introspection phase. I think when we asked that first question, it was really nice to see a lot of people in that introspection phase of really thinking through how is it that I really want to make an impact. And I think especially at a highly politicized time like now, having that reflection first, right? It's not prudent always to go out into the streets when you haven't quite figured out if that's the role that you need to play, right? And I think that the tapestry of leadership that we have, there are people, even when we think about Atlanta and Georgia and the civil rights era, there were people that made pies and food so that people who protested could come back and eat, or they handed out bottles of water. Now, not everyone's place is to be that voice. And so for me, a creative, an artist, I had to figure out how do I actually marry the arts with activism. I don't like serious political speeches. And so I think some of the best activism I've done has been through how do I make that a creative thing, that be it a spoken word poem or a song that still has that same messaging, but that is the best way I know how to move the needle.
Right. I think that that's such great advice. And sometimes our voice could be written down, right? Sometimes finding your voice means that you wrote an amazing piece, whether it is on your personal blog or you post it on LinkedIn or you send a letter, right? To speak your truth and share your suggestions. And I would say that for me, Joel, because I know Joel, that's probably where I found my voice and how I really have, and I'm still finding my voice. I think maybe maybe you feel the same way, but I certainly feel like it's finding your voice is an ongoing sort of aspect of growth. But I always tell people, I wrote a letter to my the editor of my school newspaper in middle school in the 7th grade, after we went through February, and my history teacher had not mentioned Black History Month. And so I learned the power of speaking my truth, but in the form of writing my truth, and advocating for what I believed very early on in that way. And I think it has, eventually translated into me being able to bring actual voice to my opinions and my thoughts. So we got another question. Do you see one in there that's interesting to you?
There's
Timum, it
definitely
looks like.
one in the chat that how do you support? This is Heather. How do you support change and be an ally without perpetuating the power imbalance we are working to erase? Number one, that's a very thoughtful question.
It is.
I think sometimes in the efforts to be an ally, people can center themselves and silence the other voices. And so I think part of being an ally is, how do I figure out how to create space so the people that don't have the voices being heard, how can I be a facilitator, right? I think that's one of the things that allies do. So I was at a job one time and I noticed that, there weren't a lot of people who were able to move up that were coming from, it was actually HBCUs. And I was like, how do I actually inform the recruitment and the selection process such that I create that space? And so we begin to talk about, what does it mean to tweak this recruitment model and look at things in a very different fashion? It's like, how do you create spaces now? If you're a male, how do you create space for women? If you are a white person, how do you create the space for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color to be in those spaces? Because I think you're right. We can perpetuate the very problem by recentering people. It's also about stepping back, right? Like I remember when George Floyd was happening, I got tired of being asked how I felt, right? So I think it's the perceptiveness to understand that Black people, people of color, may carry an additional emotional burden around this, because we can't be so easily divorced from that. As a Black man who has been stopped in certain instances in my car, most recently I was back home in Arkansas visiting my mom, got stopped for going 73 and a 75. Really? And I knew what that was about. And immediately I had to go into let's be the nicest Black man I can possibly be, so I survived this moment. But after I drove off, I cried, because literally all this stuff was happening in our country. And it's not just a distant thing, right? It's something that I live through every day. And so I think our allies can also be cognizant that there's a way that we walk through the world, and that we need people. I think it was mentioned in the talk about it's a numbers game, right? When you think about Selma and the difference of having white people on that bridge, right? It may not seem fair that people were a little bit more mindful about folks' humanity, and it took white people sprinkled in to make them respond differently. But that's the society and the world that we live in, and that's the reality of things. And we need those allies to show up and speak up, but also to create that space.
Yeah, and to create space without moving into the space of tokenizing and tokenism, right? So I think, Heather, it's a fine balance that you have to really work hard to strike. But I appreciate the question, and I appreciate your interest in wanting to be an ally who gets it right,
And I love what you said about tokenism, right? I don't want to be the only one there. Like that itself is a burden. And I think for those who have been in majority situations, right? The burden of being a person that offers the Black perspective on a topic, or the LGBT perspective, or whatever that perspective is, that's a lot. Like, so I appreciate being invited to spaces where I'm not the only one, because it is tokenistic. And I think that's something, when we talk about white privilege, most white people are never, they never have to think about, is my voice going to represent the entire white community, right? There's not even really a notion of the white community that you're speaking for. And so the freedom to speak from your perspective, have your voice be your opinion, is something that a lot of people of color do not have the privilege to really live inside of.
Yeah. So we've got one question, Tim, I'm in the Q&A.
Yeah.
How do you keep your energy up and passion aligned to your purpose consistently? And I'm gonna clear off a whole piece of paper to write down your answer to.
Wow. It's interesting. I just did a workshop for some educators called Self-Care for Teachers Who Care Too Much. And I think if you just replace teacher with leader, that's a real thing. Like those of us who care and are active, it can really be exhausting. And so I always say that you have to really strategize how to do that. For me, one of the things that I do is I walk a lot. And I'm walking because, okay, that's one time where I don't have my fingers on a keyboard doing some work. I have sometimes invited other people to walk with me because it creates an opportunity for conversation. If you're a workaholic like myself, make play dates with friends, with whomever, right? Because I know I tend to be a man about the cause unless something can interrupt that. But I am really respectful of my friend's time. So if I say, okay, I'm gonna have somebody meet me for dinner at 5:30, that creates an avenue where it's like, okay, I got to stop the work because it's very easy for me to continue to just work, work, work. So I think those things, I think accountability partners, I've been really good about finding other people that hold me to the things I need to work on and do. And we check in with each other. It may seem really simple, but like I love the Fitbit app because when you're doing the Fitbit, you can actually like team up with other people and you do these little challenges. And I'll have somebody text me like, you ain't walked but 2 steps today. Like, what's going on? And I'm a little embarrassed. So I may like go walk around the corner or something. But I think that's accountability. It's right, making sure that there's somebody else in your space that's holding you accountable to doing the things you need to do to take yourself out of the fight, because we can't just constantly be in that space. Change making is important, but we have to be healthy for the change. I think it was Audre Lorde that said something about something about radical self-care. And that's an important part of our activism, is like being shameless and unapologetic about taking care of ourselves.
Yes, yes. So yes, that speaks to me. So there's another question in the Q&A. Atlanta leads in income inequality in the US. What can we do as Atlantans to improve this statistic and make money/finances more equitable for individuals in our community? Heavy question, Timo. Heavy question.
It's interesting because I think we lack the language to talk a lot about class, and often we default, especially in a space like Atlanta that has historically been heavily racialized, in talking about the real burdens that happen around class. And I think sometimes if we're even having an honest conversation about Black people in Atlanta by themselves, class is so it's such a heavy thing, and we don't talk about it, but we talk about it because when we meet people, we ask what neighborhoods they live in, what schools they went to, and those kind of things. And I think that really, look at, like, when we talk about diversity, are we also looking at who do we have in our spaces that's not just a relative, right? Because we can all talk about those relatives or those cousins that didn't go as far as we maybe have gone in school, but in your friend circles and in your other circles, do you have people that are actually outside of your class standing, right? Like, and I think Atlanta is a very classist place where we can just kind of be comfortable only being with people like ourselves. And I think that that's a good push, and I think there are assumptions and biases that we have about people from different classes, when in fact, they may contribute a wealth of things, our skills or assets that we ourselves don't have because of the spaces where we sit. And so I think that that's an important push, I think, for people.
Yeah, and I think one thing I will add on that question around what can we as individuals do, right, around immobility and inequity. I think we've studied this a lot at the Chamber. There's certainly more that we can do and through our work, and we're working towards it. But transit has an impact on inequity, immobility. So does workforce development, so does education, supporting Black-owned businesses, that's wealth building, voting literally for all of these kinds of things, and advocating for, what you believe in, and elected officials who stand with you, I think are all things that we as individuals can do. Rolling up your sleeves to volunteer with organizations.
I was going to say volunteerism is a really good way, and it's not just sort of showing up at the kitchen and pouring the soup, but the conversation that you have with the person that you poured soup with. I mean, I think there's a way that we can show up across those racial lines, but we don't have meaningful conversations with people, and poverty then becomes a spectacle that we kind of talk about. So what does it mean to put myself in a place of service where I'm actually engaging people in a real and meaningful way, and I maintain those connections. So I think there are families that I supported when I was in Atlanta that I still have conversations with. I still check on these people. They still check on me, and oftentimes that's an inspiration and a motivation. A lot of them are just, they're inspired by my story so much that they really want. I've had a few people go back to school because they're like, hey, like I can still do this, and I'm like, yeah, you absolutely can. So I think that's when those meaningful connections is really what can make that change happen.
Yeah, and I do have to say, for people that may be in a position where you can hire, promote, maybe fire, you can set, wages, even if you are hiring an intern, I think sometimes we don't view ourselves as having authority or being empowered to make suggestions that could affect equity and mobility for others. And I think sometimes we just have to raise our voice, ask a question, make a suggestion, and those sorts of things, even in our workplaces. And to your point, I wrote it down. If you move one person, you have moved mountains, right? So
I remember talking to a security guard that worked in a building that I worked at in Atlanta, and she hadn't finished a degree, and we just had conversations, and I began to encourage, well, maybe a course at a time. This young woman now is a teacher. She went back, she got her degree in education, is an excellent educator right now, but if I didn't take the time to actually have the conversation, right? So often we look at people and their lot in life as permanent, right? And a lot of us are still growing, and we have places we want to reach. Why not the people that so often are on the front lines, that are serving us, that are doing the jobs that are really tough? They have places they want to go to.
Yes. And so not having a fixed mindset towards others, I think is very important.
Right.
So Cynthia Curry, who is my colleague, is asking, what are some of your favorite media sources, Timon? What podcasts, movies, books, etc. are you consuming?
Wow. So, I interestingly, I do really enjoy podcasts. I've been doing a lot of reading, but a lot of the reading that I do comes out of podcasts. So, selfish plug, I do have a podcast called the Brave Educator Podcast, and I've interviewed Mark Lamont Hill and Kiese Lehman and Eliza Byard from GLSEN. So that's something you can check out. And there's often literature and books that are mentioned in there. So I think podcast is a really good medium. It's interesting. It's kind of hard to avoid we may talk down about Facebook or Instagram, but right now there's actually a lot of interesting, I find out about a lot of books and materials through just basic social media. I do a lot of work. And so often it's like through my social media feeds that I actually learn about new things and new books. And I actually found how to be an anti-racist through a Facebook post. And I think some of those groups, and I'm a part of a group called Southwest Atlanta Neighbors. Hopefully, so there's somebody on the call from that group today, because I actually shared it with folks. But that's a group where people will throw out ideas, things like everything from financial planning and financial management to to how to get involved in voting and encouraging voter equity and people having access to voting, and how people can get involved. So I think it's really just looking for it. Google is a powerful tool. You can pretty much Google and find anything you want. So I think beyond specific mediums, looking for books, joining a book club. That's where I do most of my reading. I'm a part of 2 different book clubs right now, and they make really good recommendations on things I can read.
Great. Well, look, I think we're almost at time. I want to thank you again just for being so amazing and so courageous. Your story is so very powerful, Timum. I'm just happy to know you, happy to get to know you better this evening. And I'm going to turn to Ashley for closing remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Timum, Isha. What a great conversation. I don't know about the rest of you all, but my paper is full as well. I was jotting down notes, so many great insights, and just a lot of things that I think, we can take from this and think a little bit more and figure out, how do we incorporate some of these small things into our experience and how we become a change maker. One thing that really stood out to me was, honing your strengths. And we talked about being an introvert and like how there are things that come innately to you that you might not necessarily think of as strengths, but really can help you to hone your space as a change maker. So I hope that all of you all took a lot of great notes and have a lot of things that you're going to think about and start to enact. A couple of things that I just want to mention as we close out. There are a couple of other events that are coming up. Tomorrow, actually, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights is doing an event around education disparities. That's happening at 12 p.m. tomorrow. You can go to equitydignity.org for more information and to sign up for that. And then also, at the Metro Atlanta Chamber, we are continuing our innovation series. So if you are interested in entrepreneurship, we have an event coming up next Tuesday, and you can check out metroatlantachamber.com for more information on that. And then also just in general, we want to continue to engage with you. So we hope that each and every one of you will follow both ChooseATL and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights on all of our different channels. Talk to us, let us know what you're thinking and how we can continue to support you. So again, a special thank you to each of you for your time and for participating with us tonight. Make sure you stay connected with us. Follow Timum, go listen to his podcast, and we will see you next time.